Thank you, Jamie. And thanks for coming. And I do feel like, I don't know, I feel like I should allow everybody to stand up and jump around or something, but then we'd all get pretty kind of sweaty, I'm guessing. But anyway, thanks for sitting through my talk, and I hope it's energetic enough to keep you aware and awake and interested and moving towards lesson plans and that sort of stuff. So on that note, as Mark Winnie was talking about states getting in the way of local regulations, Jamie Bender mentioned right at the end of my for introduction that I studied for my dissertation milk policy, which I all know. I think I urge you to put that into a lesson plan right away. But there's actually a lot you can learn from looking just at milk. And one example of this is Chicago was actually, I was forgetting the year, it was either 1907 or 1909, the first city in the world to mandate pasteurization of all milk except actually what's called medical milk, which was certified by a medical board. So if you're a raw milk fan, we were in the leadership of the pasteurization movement. Another thing that the city did, which was a kind of public health feat back at the time, is that it mandated that all milk came from cows that had been certified that they were tuberculosis-free. And at the time, there was a lot of debate over tuberculin testing for cows. Some farmers didn't think that that people could get tuberculosis from milk from cows. They actually could. It turned out to be the main way people got tuberculosis, but it was possible. And they thought that perhaps the cows could get tuberculosis through the tuberculin testing process. So it just so happened that the head of the State House out in Springfield was a dairy farmer. And in 1912, so about 3 years later, he influenced the state legislature to pass a law saying that no city could require tuberculin testing of cows. So not only did Chicago then was not able to enforce its tuberculin testing law, also because Wisconsin and surrounding states were requiring tuberculin testing, all these tuberculin positive cows started flowing into Illinois. And for about 15 years, the Chicago milk market was getting milk from a lot of tuberculin testing cows. Well, fortunately, in this case, pasteurized, but it's sort of a real example of kind of the state over kind of, I guess, making it so that the city cannot control its food supply. If you want to read more on that, you can go to my dissertation. But I decided to start out there because it's not like these issues of urban versus rural, like where is your food coming from? What is your farmer like? These kinds of questions that people have. Who is getting kind of the best food in a city? It's not like they're new. Actually, another milk story back when they were trying to figure out whether to require pasteurization, I read a lecture given by the health commissioner of, I can't remember if it's the US or there's a number of lectures. My dissertation's going back a little while in my mind now. But, and I think it was the health commissioner of Chicago, and he was saying that, ideally, we would have a milk supply that was so clean that we didn't need pasteurization. Because even then, they knew that in the process of pasteurization, certain enzymes seemed to be destroyed. They knew that overall, that the pasteurized product, was a little if it was probably not quite as healthy as the non-pasteurized product, if the non-pasteurized product wasn't containing any diseases. And this guy said, well, you know, we would prefer that all milk came from raw. All milk was what we'd call raw. But in order to do that, we'd have to have so many controls on the milk that it would be actually like what they were calling certified or medical milk, which was served in hospitals at the time. And it's only in those places or for the wealthiest individuals that we can actually afford this sort of premium milk. So this is like 1910, 1909, sometime in that period. And, you know, still there's that kind of break within a city like Chicago between people who can sort of afford the highest quality, the most local, often the best tasting produce and foods, and people who often can't. So the question often comes down to, well, how, and this is what it came down to in the progressive era and now, and you know, going back into the 1800s, we have large cities which have a lot of people who, well, and we have actually large areas of rural America too that have a lot of people who don't have a large amount of money to spend on food. So how do we create a food system that is fair and healthy and yet sort of and fits into the amount of resources that people in general in America have? It's a real problem, especially now with the stuff like the wages going down with places like Walmart not paying that much. But this is a problem that's going on for a while. The food issue came into the fore really back in those early periods in the 1900s where Chicago was doubling in size every 10 years. Can you imagine trying to figure out how do you feed all those people? And that's why the Department of Public Health was thinking about this, and that's why I wound up studying milk and the rise of the food system. But then I got to Chicago. I actually grew up here, went to UCLA for my dissertation, decided to study Chicago while I was at UCLA, which might not have been a great choice. We added a couple years to my PhD program anyway. But then I came back here. I got a job at Chicago State in 1999. And it just so happened that the Community Food Security Coalition, which actually Mark Winnie is very prominent in, was having a meeting here in Chicago then. And my parents were sort of publicly oriented. Well, my dad's a professor at Loyola. They're criminologists. My mom works for the state. And they're very publicly oriented sociologists, criminologists. And I had this idea, you know, I'm coming back home. I want to do something public. I want to work with the community to utilize the sort of research background that I have in some kind of positive way. So at this Community Food Security Coalition meeting, which was a national meeting, I met some local folks who had helped organize it. And they said, come down to this meeting at the Garfield Park Conservatory, let's talk. Because the two things I knew about were A, the food history of the early 1900s. And I'm not sure, well, I mean, we could hold the whole lecture just on that milk stuff if you want, but it didn't seem like that related all that closely with the activism of, you know, 1999, although I tried very hard to show how it related. And the other thing I did is I drew maps. I'm a cartographer, and I work a lot with what's called geographic information systems. So I go down to this meeting, I'm saying, well, I do this food stuff, food system stuff, history, and then I do these maps. And they said, you know, what we really need is maps of where grocery stores are in Chicago. Because, you know, we have this idea that there's a lot more grocery stores in certain parts of the city than others, and there's a lot more there's certainly a lot more grocery stores in, say, in white areas than in minority areas, especially black neighborhoods. But we don't have like maps. We couldn't really prove that. So I was working with these folks, and I wound up studying. I wound up working with them on the study of Austin, which is the furthest out west neighborhood of Chicago, comparing the access to food in Austin with the access to food in Oak Park. Not what that slide's about, but we did this community-based study where we went out and we found that, there were actually a lot of grocery stores in Austin, but they were all really small. And the food that was there was not particularly good. There was actually produce at about half of these little corner stores, you call it. There's like 60 corner stores. Half of them had produce, but at 16 of those 30, that produce was what we called unacceptable quality. And that quality, unacceptable in this case, meant rotting. So it didn't just mean a hard tomato, it meant a rotting tomato. And so we actually learned some things that, there was these stores, but they weren't providing the community very well with fresh fruits and vegetables. And there were a couple of independent supermarkets, and one chain supermarket in Austin. Austin is a neighborhood of 107,000 people. It's the largest community area in Chicago in terms of population. So that isn't many grocery stores for an area of 107,000 people. So we took that, and then I went on to doing some studies of the whole region. And that's where I come today to talking about food deserts in general and food sovereignty. And I'm going to try to relate the concept of food deserts, which has actually come up in the news much, much more in the last few years than it did back in 1999. To some political issues, to food sovereignty issues that you talked about, I think, a couple days ago, and then relate it back to Chicago. So, the concept of a food desert is an area with low access to quality groceries, and it's captured the public interest in many cities, but it's a concept that is very easy to grab onto. The issue is that it's fairly simplistic. So we have this idea that, all right, there's areas with low access to quality groceries versus other areas that don't have quality groceries. But what is a quality grocery, for instance? And a lot of times food deserts are related to obesity. So let's say, well, we don't have access to food, so therefore there's obesity. But the reasons for obesity go beyond just one thing. So the problem is, well, if you open a new store in a community, will that solve the obesity issue? Let's say we open a Food for Less, which is one of the things that's opened around Chicago. Is that going to solve the obesity issue? So this is why there's a question mark behind food deserts. The food desert concept was actually, the word food desert, or I guess the term, was originally used by a resident of a public sector housing project in the west of Scotland. And it was used not, and the project that she used it in was, she was an activist, and she wanted to sort of show how being in an isolated, low-income area affected daily life. So she wasn't actually as interested in food as she was interested in poverty, and sort of trying to show how being in poverty affected where you live, and being where you lived affected sort of how you had to go through your daily life. So a general definition of food deserts: urban neighborhoods and rural towns without ready access to fresh, healthy, and affordable food. Marie Gallagher, who's done quite a bit of work in Chicago, said it's called a large geographic area that has no or distant mainstream grocery stores. It's actually one of the questions. Should it be mainstream? What is the definition of mainstream? Is it, a lot of people measure it using chains, a lot of different things. Now, in 2010, something called the Healthy Food Financing Initiative was announced by the Obama administration. Actually, Mark Winnie mentioned the Healthy Food Financing Initiative in Pennsylvania. This kind of followed that same model. So the idea was, had a goal of eliminating food deserts. So there's more than $400 million just in 2010 that went to that in that budget, including new market tax credits. Those tend to go to banks to open retail stores in underserved communities, and supports community development financial institutions. Like one of those was South Shore Bank. They're not here anymore, but that kind of banks with a particularly community focus. So they put a lot of money into that for supermarket projects, also loans and grants. So it's become a focus of the Obama administration. 2011, even before Rahm Emanuel was in office, he said, I'm going to have a focus on eliminating food deserts. Food access was one of the 28 community focus areas of Mayor Emanuel's transition plan, and he called the plan that he in general, a scorecard for the first 100 days of the administration. So in terms of food deserts, he pledged to organize a summit, seek out new partners, work out zoning changes to promote urban agriculture and aquaponics, which is something he's actually done. Basically, he's done all these things, create a plan for eliminating the worst food deserts on predominantly African-American South and West sides. So again, there's a real focus, both of the national government and here locally, on eliminating food deserts. So we had a food summit. We had Michelle Obama come out. There's Michelle Obama, Rahm Emanuel. They're at Walgreens that has added, so there's been a number of Walgreens that have expanded their fresh food section, although they're still certainly not supermarket size, and a lot of folks complain that the food is expensive, but it's there. And down at the bottom, you see Emanuel and Michelle Obama at Growing Power, which is a wonderful food security, food access organization that has a great local farm just west of here in the Englewood, actually just west of Bridgeport, like 35th, just west of Bridgeport neighborhood. All right, so why all this focus on food deserts? Well, I think actually there's a lot of political reasons why food deserts sort of fit as a political issue to focus on. Whether or not, it's something, I'm not against the focus, though I think a lot of times it's a little simplistic. One is that, all right, if you're gonna pick something to go on your scorecard, like Emanuel did, something where you can create an index so that change or improvement can be easily measured, and the solution, in this case, a new store, can be easily seen, and also opening a new store generally involves government promotion of community development project through private companies, partnership with private companies, often partnering with community development corporations, neighborhood groups. Everybody's happy, all right? It's kind of something you can easily measure. It's something that generally, makes friends both with people like Walgreens and community organizations. Other solutions, such as gardens, and Emanuel has been putting money into gardens and such too, often involve partnerships with community organizations, also good politically. Indexes can be used by neighborhood organizations for soliciting funding. So I have actually been in the past, I've done food desert maps of Chicago. Marie Gallagher, I just mentioned, has done food desert maps of Chicago, often actually with, she's done a number of iterations of them, but one of her food desert maps was based on data I gave her. But the way we calculated them wound up being different. So certain neighborhoods that I didn't say were food deserts, she did. So people would come up to me and say, Danny, I'm a leader of a community organization, and I just want to tell you, we wrote this grant and we're using Mari's food desert calculation because it says that we're a food desert and you don't. So, and I said, okay, that's fine. We'll use whatever you need to get money. But it's one of those things that we could see out of BAP that's easily calculated, et cetera. It has all these political reasons why it's popular. Finally, the story plays pretty well. So here's this Bobby Rush, who who I believe is the representative from right here, though I'm not certain of that, but on the South Side U.S. House representative, saying, why is it in some communities consumers can buy fresh French fries but not fresh potatoes? So that kind of comparison plays really well in the press, and there is something to it, and it's something that we need to, act on, but it also is something that's saying, all right, we got to do something about this. In this case, I have not yet found a community where you can't buy fresh potatoes, and because they may be expensive and they may be sitting in a box at the back of the corner store, and they may not be kept chilled at all and may go bad, but they're there somewhere. Mary Schmick, who I think recently won a Pulitzer Prize, said this. Note here in this quote the connection between race, class, and food access. So she's, this was written on the day of or soon after the opening of the huge Whole Foods, which is at the time the largest one in the country, by North and Clybourne. And so she said she's wandering through the Whole Foods, and gets a call from this hunger advocate. And she's looking at the bounty at Whole Foods, and she's comparing it to what she's hearing from this hunger advocate. So a black baby in Chicago is 2.5 times more likely than the national average to die in the first year. One reason so many babies in Chicago die, the mothers are more likely to be sick, wine and cheese bar on the left. And one reason that the mothers are sick, they don't have access to fresh food. Probiotics on the right, bakery and sushi on the right, up ahead. She says that no city will ever offer equality of everything to everybody, but we live in a city where multitudes pay $7.99 a pound at the Whole Foods salad bar. It's time to help the other multitudes find a decent apple. All this, I'm sharing all this to say when we talk about food deserts, a lot of times the talk turns to issues of race and class and spatial inequality. And that, yes, it's about food, but the stories are also about how, about talking about that spatial inequality, which is often something we can't get at, but we have trouble talking about, voicing in other kinds of ways. At the same time, things like health inequalities are being mapped and seen, and you do hear about that. But food is one way that people can say, oh, okay, I see how if it's hard for me to buy a fresh asparagus in my neighborhood, or fresh produce in general, then I associate fresh produce with healthier eating, so it would be harder for me to feed my family fresh produce. And we all sort of can relate to that. So, but in reality, where it is in a way that we can talk about how inequalities in American society spatialize, get seen in place. Does that make sense? So I don't know if that's, actually I teach college. I think there's some of you are community college teachers, and some of you who are high school and going down. But I think one of the things I've done is had people go out to stores and with a list of foods, what we call a market basket study, to see what's there and what's not. And students can actually compare stores in different neighborhoods, or even in some neighborhoods, even make maps of what's there, what kinds of stores are there, and maybe compare 2 different neighborhoods for that. There was a great project that was done at the Proviso, like math and science high school, this Proviso magnet school, doing just that sort of thing, comparing one neighborhood in Proviso Township with another, and actually with a nearby wealthy community, I think it was River Forest, and looking at what kinds of stores were there and what was in the stores. And they learned quite a bit. These were high school honor students. So another reason for the strength of the food desert concept is maps like this. Now, there may be better maps out there, but this is one I've done. So the red areas are the areas that are closest to the nearest supermarket. And then the sort of hatched areas are predominantly African-American communities. And you can see, note that the sort of beige is non-residential. All of those different colors are streets. So I only colored in the streets, the residential streets. So the blue areas are the areas that are furthest away from a store. And you can see it's almost always, except for Hegwish, which is way far southeast, African-American neighborhoods that are furthest from the nearest store. There are stores in African-American neighborhoods, but the food desert communities in Chicago itself generally are in African-American areas. And that map shows that correlation pretty starkly. Now, it's not true for every city exactly like this, but at least if you're telling a story about race and income and class and how that affects people's everyday life, something like this tells the story pretty well. And I think actually, maps like this have been on the front page, not this map, but other maps like this, have been on the front page of the Trib and other newspapers, and the maps themselves sort of tell that story. So, this is basically what I've said. What food deserts communicate, it's more than just distance to nearest store. This tie between food deserts and general inequality. The idea of communities without adequate food access communicates with this. It relates to daily difficulties in daily living that could specifically affect health. So that thing that we all go out and buy food, this is something that, when I present this stuff, we all have stories about grocery shopping. Very few people I have found actually are happy with their grocery shopping, with their alternatives of what they can buy, what the stores are. Talk to people who live here in Hyde Park. There are all sorts of discussions of grocery shopping. Where I live in Oak Park, same thing. Even though we have stores, but then I want to go over here. I travel 6 miles for this. So anyway, because I like this jewel over here rather than that jewel. We can relate to this struggle and the fact that people have even harder times than us. And I'm saying we by meaning people who live outside of food deserts. The people living inside food deserts, you think of, when I present this stuff in Englewood, have amazingly long discussions about their daily struggles to get food and the feelings they feel when they go into stores. So another thing, and this is why we didn't just do mapping, but we've talked to people who live in food desert areas, is that many people understand, experience and understand differences in race partially by looking at the retail landscape of their communities. And I'll share a quote in a few minutes, but a lot of times when people look out at sort of the business streets in their community and they see corner stores and they don't see what other people have, which might be a Jewel or a Dominic's, the fact that their community has been passed over for something like a grocery store, which is something that's so sort of integral to sort of American culture and daily life, it tells them, or seems to tell them, at least through the quotes we have, that you are somehow not as good or outside of the general American capitalist community, which basically the economy is not. Somehow there has not been retail investment in your community that has brought these grocery stores in, thus somehow you are not as good. And so people see actually racism often through how they're treated at grocery stores and the fact that there aren't adequate grocery stores in their community. All that being said, there's really a lot of trouble with just measuring food deserts. What sort of stores do you count? What kind of data do you use? What do you do about population density? You'd think that, like, the Gold Coast or areas with high population density would have more grocery stores than areas with low population density. So, we can't really say, well, that we probably shouldn't just look at distance to grocery store as the way to measure, because areas that are more dense would have less distance to nearest grocery store, you would think. What kind of analysis techniques you use. You can read our report online to go through these different kinds of analysis techniques, but basically, do you just count the number of stores in a neighborhood? Do you look at the distance to nearest store? Do you do like different kinds of high-level techniques, like what I call spatial clustering, to see where there's clusters of stores? One real issue is because of things like the focus of a manual, there's often an official push to just use one index. So I like to say, well, here's the distance to this kind of store, this kind of store, this kind of store, and not use just one index, but they want just one index. So then I'm often pushed in that way, and I come up with something that I'm not that happy about. I don't want to go through all these definitions so that I want to leave some time for questions, but basically these are definitions in practice, meaning that the USDA food desert map that you can look up online says that in an urban area, track greater than 1 mile to the nearest supermarket, that's a food desert. In a rural area, 5 miles. But I say something different. I'm Block 2008. Marie Gallagher said something different. So how we operationalize in our studies the definition of food desert is different too. This comes from CMAP. How many CMAP, the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning? They're our regional planning body. I work with them to do a food desert map for the 7-county, actually it was 6, because we didn't have data for Kendall at the time. But the 6-county Chicago metro area, the red areas are food desert areas. This is part of the Go to 2040 plan, our region's official regional plan for this period going to 2040. You'll see right there an odd food desert up on the far north side. That is actually West Rogers Park. West Rogers Park. This is Devon Avenue. Not your definition of food desert, really, but there don't happen to be any supermarkets there, so it got classified as a food desert. So I just say that this is an issue with using one index and an issue just relying with one map. And I told them, why are we putting that in? But they said, you have to follow the one index. I'm like, all right. Another issue is shopping behavior is really complex. If we're just looking at distance to one kind of store, this is from a group of interviews we did in Austin back in 2004. Every week I normally shop at Tony's. I look in the sale paper, and sometimes more than once a week, because I see a sale, I go in a store just to pick up those items. I shop at Tony's, Jewel, Dominic's, Billy's, which used to be a produce store in Oak Park, and Leamington sometimes. All these different, Leamington's still is a small, privately owned supermarket. She's shopping at Tony's, that's sort of an independent chain here in the region. All sorts of stores. So if you're just looking at distance to, say, supermarkets, you wouldn't catch the Billy's that she shops at to get produce, or did before it closed. So these were some of the things that we used in developing, the ideas we use in developing the Northeast Illinois Community Food Security Assessment, which is what that CMAP map was based on. So I was given some money, and I shared it with UIC, to do a mapping and analysis of food access in the 6-county Chicago metropolitan area. We were given the money by the Searle funds of the Chicago Community Trust. So we partnered with community groups in 6 areas to do some interviews, and we did that large-scale mapping. This is some mapping, how we did it. This is, anybody know where that is? Anybody guess? You made a geography of the... Somebody said Oak Park. Austin's here, northwest side up there. All of those little squiggly lines are streets. The dots are stores. So we measured the street distance to the nearest store of different types. So this was full surface supermarkets, but there's a whole bunch of different ones that we measured. We did it in 2005 and 2007, and we came up with maps like this. So these are different types of stores. And just want to point out, should have brought a little pointy thing, but chain discount stores, it's like Aldi, Save-A-Lot. Look at blue areas are low access zones, red areas high access zones. There were, at that time, many of those stores. Sorry. Anyway, there were at that time many.
Middle one on the bottom, yep.
Hey, there we go. Many of those kinds of stores on the North Shore, I don't think they're still, although they're growing, especially the last few years. There's a lot more in the northwest suburbs. Can I take that off? I'm stuck here. But you can see differences with large supermarkets, which is the one we use the most, and all groceries. This pattern actually is often sort of opposite of this pattern. And actually, chain full service is more opposite. If you look at Chicago, you can see it a little better. So look right here. This is sort of the food desert map. The blue are the areas with lower access to stores. The red, the areas with higher. This is taking into account population density. So even taking into account the lower population density on the south side, there's still lower access to food, to any kind of independent or chain food store, or at least there was in 2007, than there is on the north side. Does that make sense? So it's not just population density. So we did some analysis looking at different kinds of neighborhoods. U of C map library, based on the 2000 census, had divided the city up or the region up into 10 different kinds of 10 different kinds of neighborhoods, and like low income, by race, by family type, et cetera, et cetera. And the results were sort of, our quantitative results were kind of as you'd expect. Impoverished African American neighborhoods are further than would be predicted from all store types except chain discount. Predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods, and we haven't talked about this yet, are actually closer than would be predicted to independent stores, but further than predicted to chain full service stores. So the difference between African American and Hispanic neighborhoods in terms of food access tends to be that the Hispanic neighborhoods have independent, or we would say small chain stores that are specifically focused on the Hispanic community. They're also starting to get actually large chain stores specifically focused on the Hispanic community, but they don't have as, the numbers of Jewel's and Dominic's traditional full service stores are the same in African American and Hispanic communities. The difference are these other stores. Wealthy urban communities like, say, Lakeview, Lincoln Park, are closer to them than predicted by their population density to all store types, but discount. And the issue that policymakers had with my study was there wasn't just one single index. All right, I'm gonna run through these fairly quickly, so tell me to slow down. I talked about milk for too long. I want you to have some time to ask questions. All right, so we also did interviews. And this is where things like the connections between race and food access come up. So this is a community, actually this is from our earlier study in Austin too. A female African American consumer said, in the predominantly white neighborhood I've went to the produce, seen unusual vegetables and fruits near them, they would have little pamphlets explaining, talking about the nutrition of fruit, where it comes from, what it's supposed to taste like, and how it should be used. But I've never seen that in my neighborhood. So she's actually comparing what was a Dominic's in her neighborhood to a Dominic's in another neighborhood. And saying, well, I've been to the Dominic's in this other neighborhood, and there's these nice little displays, She talked about star fruit, and there was this like, little recipe, how to use star fruit, what it was. And she didn't see that in her Dominick's that was near Austin in North Lawndale. It's closed now. And this is from Englewood from 2006. A female voice saying, we just don't get proper food. They give us the bottom of everything. Male voice saying, it's like that because, as I said before, the stores in the black community get worse food than the white community. They care about what they give them in the suburbs, but here they don't care. They say, oh, well, give them whatever and they'll take it. Yeah, that's it. Give them whatever. They get greedy. So see how folks are experiencing food deserts within Englewood and tying that back to race and racism. So let's think about some of the things that have come out of Emmanuel's initiative. Walgreens announced the opening of expanded food section. You saw the pictures in 19 stores in addition to the 10 that had already completed before Emmanuel came in. And another more exciting thing, I think, is that they are also purchasing through local farmers through Growing Power, but Growing Power is actually aggregating the food of a whole bunch of small farmers, including like some that I work with who are really small on the far south sides, and selling them to Walgreens. That's kind of cool. But as I said, there's been complaints that I've heard. I haven't done a study, but I've just heard from folks that those Walgreens are still, the food is not very well priced. And it's not a full-service supermarket. It's still something in the middle. More like, actually, what you might get at Save-A-Lot or Aldi. So there's 9 new Save-A-Lot stores, 1 new Aldi, 2 Walmarts, and 2 new Mariano's, which is an upscale full-service chain. One of these Mariano's is supposed to be in a food desert location. I believe that is going to be part of the U.S. Steel site, Southworks rehabilitation or redo down around 87th in the lake. That's an upscale store, though. So out of all of these, the only real full-scale chain supermarkets are the Walmarts. There's also an Urban Ag Zoning Act that's been passed, which is actually a really great thing. But, as I said, expanded Walgreens aren't meant to be full-service supermarkets. Save-A-Lot stores are small, so only one of these new Walmarts is even in a food desert. So here's that same map you just saw. So here are the Walmarts. One is near, I think, either 79th or 87th in the Dan Ryan. Is it 83rd? There's a supermarket right there anyway. So not that folks aren't going there, but there was a supermarket there. I know, but there's a Food for Less and a Jewel right by there. Isn't there? And a Dominick? There was a Dominick's that closed. What? No, but I mean next. Anyway, what? No. There's a Jewel. There's a Jewel. I'll take you down there and show you the store. Anyway, what? Oh, that's the store I mean. So 83rd. Anyway, my point is that obviously could be argued, and we could argue, but it's 87. What I mean is that even by that definition, that you need to be like 2 or 3 miles from the nearest store to be a food desert. That's not a food desert. Not that folks aren't happy that Walmart is there. Some people, but it is in an area that there were actually stores there. And then this store, which is going to open next year, which is in the Roseland community, or Pullman community, actually, along I-94. And that will actually definitely be in a food desert. There isn't any supermarkets anywhere near there. The closest is the 95th and Stony Island, whatever the store is, 95th and Stony Island Jewel. So my conclusions from all that is maps often, they reveal inequality, but the stories they can tell can be somewhat simplistic. So what we don't want is just to look at a map like that and fill in the holes. Yes, it's important for stories to come in, but if all we do is just fill in the holes, we won't get true community development. Just one story doesn't develop a community. So there's other things that need to be done. It's really about developing community health, developing communities in general, not just about opening one store. So that's where things like food sovereignty come in. So which I think you've already talked about a bit, but the idea of sovereignty, control over local land use and food policy, it resonates with these issues because part of food access is about control over local land. Does that make, so it's about what happens on pieces of local land. And that's where things like community garden projects, that sort of stuff is so exciting because there's not just people are producing, but people are creating places where they can come together and places where they can control what actually happens on that piece of land. And lead towards economic development. So the food justice, I would say in general, demands that we respect cultural and economic needs, and that includes an access to a variety of alternative mainstream food sources. So me personally, you know, just in terms of the food, the fact that, say, Walmart is opening on off of 94, that does help the food supply. But, you know, that's not all. If all you do is open that store, Roseland, the very, an area that has a lot of need, is quite poor. You know, some people in Roseland will get jobs, but in terms of economic development, you need to do things right in Roseland. Things like community gardens, things like urban agriculture, that sort of stuff builds Roseland itself. So this is from an article on food and racism, power imbalances. So food and agriculture lends itself to addressing racism and power imbalances because food is so central to communities. And if you had working communities, you have justice and equality. So food security cannot be divorced from the issues of concern to communities. Now, I'm guessing if you talk to people in Roseland, they're probably happy that Walmart is going to open. But they have a lot of other concerns too. And the sort of, you know, just having only that one option is probably not going to solve all those concerns. But looking at some community food projects in Chicago, this is a large one, Growing Home, that's out in Englewood, that works with folks coming often, either it's a job development program, often working with people coming out of prison, but also other people who have needs for job development. They sell their produce to some of the best markets in Chicago. So one of the issues here is they've had sort of issues connecting up with the community and both selling the produce and bringing community folks in. This is a great example of a group that's no longer with us, unfortunately, but Healthy South Chicago, which went out and did its own mapping of the South Chicago area and a market basket study where they looked at what was in these stores, and they actually did some things where they set out outside the small stores and did little recipe swaps and did a lot of teaching related to bringing in produce into corner stores where it wasn't there already. And with that, I think one of the best examples I've seen. I say thank you to all these folks and to you guys for listening.
I just have a question about the mapping. And I was thinking that in very poor areas, 2 or 3 miles away is too far to go for food. Because, so it seems like somehow that should be taken into account the socioeconomic status that the stores need to be closer for people that don't have cars.
How I tried to do that was with the neighborhood classification, so I just sort of reported on it, so the poor neighborhoods tended to be further away. But transportation, one of the issues, like even, let's say we take transportation into account by looking at driving time. Well, what if you don't have a car? So another thing we've done is put, as Mark Winnie was talking about, you sort of put the bus routes over it. But a lot of people aren't actually taking the bus to get to the store in Chicago. When we did our interviews, a lot of people were borrowing a car once a week from a relative or something. So it's a lot of it is about kind of the difficulties that people have in accessing food that are harder in those communities. And really, you're absolutely right. Like in Barrington, you have to, I think the average distance to the nearest store is something like 3 or 4 miles, because it's very low population density area and a very wealthy area. So that's not very worrisome. But in a region like Alkel Gardens, where the distance to the nearest store is, I think, almost 4 miles, we found evidence that people were basically trading away all of their SNAP money, all of their food stamp money, to get a ride to the store, and other things too. So it's absolutely something you need to take into account. I think it's how to fit that all into one index is kind of the research issue that I've never, I prefer to just sort of lay out the data on the neighborhood rather than you know, try and push it all into one index.
I think it's just a good exercise for students to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you can look at income, or like if you could go on the census site or just give students census data on automobile access, and then try and relate that to some of the data on food access, that would be a really interesting thing to do.
Dr. Block, could you tell me if you have done any correlation between the crime in an area versus the number of food sources available?
I'd say 2 things. One is we've talked to store owners about crime issues, and some of the store owners talk a lot about, like the guy who owns Leamington's in Austin talked about all these issues he had with crime, and somebody drove like a truck into through his front window and started looting the store. There was all these various issues. However, other reports are that the highest crime from stores tends to be in areas, or highest stealing from stores tends to be in areas around college campuses. So I don't know. And then there's correlations. I mean, one of the things about food desert maps in general is that in terms of things like violent crime, it's usually these same neighborhoods that are where there has been disinvestment. A lot of times that disinvestment goes along with population moving out. So it's only sort of either older populations or people who own their houses, or people who say have trouble leaving a community who have stayed. So an area like East Garfield Park is, I think, 1/4 the population that it was maybe 50 years ago. So that means that there's trouble bringing in stores, but there are also abandoned communities in sort of a general sense that have had, and those communities often tend to have high crime rates in general. So, and high rates of diseases. So what strikes you is the correlation between all of these different patterns that I would say goes along with sort of community disinvestment in general. And that's perhaps where the ties to race and income and sort of historical issues within America tie in. But the store owners certainly are worried about crime, and I would say the ones we've talked to are in these communities talk about crime quite a bit, and it is an issue.
My question is about vertical farms, the idea that you put full-scale farming operations into high-rise buildings. And I know that this is still at the concept stage. These aren't actually built projects yet, but I wonder if you see any interest in this idea at the government level.
Well, there's a vertical farm that's going in over here in the Stockyards district called The Plant, which has received a lot of interest and focus.
Really?
The plant is, well, it's an old plant of some sort. I'm trying to remember what kind. I think a meatpacking plant. There is quite a bit of interest among both activists and government in things like vertical farms. I'm not sure if, the worry I have is, well, kind of how industrial sort of these become. But they are definitely an interesting idea where in places where there is not much space for farming. The south side, though, there's actually quite a bit of space, vacant lots and other things that we can use. So I am a little bit skeptical and this is because I kind of see it as a I don't know, hip architectural idea that might get a little more focus than some lower tech ideas that actually would be easier to put into place. But it comes from somebody who really doesn't know very much about vertical farming. So it's just the kind of thing that I tend to be a little enamored with low-tech solutions.